Is the Shroud of Turin the burial cloth of Jesus? There is no scientific consensus. This is a real mystery, so don't trust one source. When I Google Shroud of Turin, a Wikipedia article is the top result. Wikipedia states as fact, quote, radiocarbon dating has shown it to be a medieval artifact, end quote. This is not true. There is a lot wrong with the radiocarbon dating of the Shroud of Turin. Nothing against carbon-14 dating in general, but a lot of studies have provided compelling evidence that does not agree with the medieval hypothesis, and that's all it is, a hypothesis. A more recent study used the Freedom of Information Act to obtain the carbon dating raw data showing inconsistencies in the results. And this study was even published in the same scientific journal as the original 1988 radiocarbon test. I do think that carbon-14 can give a somewhat accurate date in some circumstances, for example the Dead Sea Scrolls, but the scrolls were hidden in a cave and stored in clay jars. In its undisputed historical record, the shroud was handled by hundreds of people when it was displayed for hours on end, often during high temperatures, and microbes containing carbon could have changed the carbon date. They only took one sample from the worst area, a corner, where it was definitely held up while on display. When lit with UV fluorescence, the tested sample does not appear to be representative of the whole shroud. And since this corner was holding up the weight of the shroud, it may have needed to be repaired in some way, causing further contamination. Dye and gum were found on the threads after the testing. There was no chemical analysis or comprehensive examination prior to testing. The samples were treated with acid solution, but the acid solution required to remove the dye and gum from the threads would have had to be much more acidic. The carbon dating was not a blind test due to the shroud's distinct herringbone weave pattern. When the labs received the samples, they would have been able to identify the shroud samples when compared to the control samples. Instead of using multiple samples from different areas of the shroud, they took this one contaminated sample and sent it to just 3 labs instead of the 7 labs available at the time. The 3 labs, Arizona, Oxford, and Zurich, all got different dates. From left to right across the shroud, you go from an older date to a younger date. There should have been no conferring between the labs, and they should have been published separately. It is not possible for the 1988 radiocarbon dating to offer conclusive evidence, so it hasn't really shown the shroud to be a medieval artifact, and actually raises more questions than it answers. The results also conflict with the wealth of evidence that suggest a much older date. 1260 to 1390 ! Was written on the chalkboard, and the shroud was proudly declared a fake. And these labs sure did love the spotlight and were quick to exploit their perceived success. One of the labs received a £1 million donation from anonymous businessmen, but the Shroud of Turin continues to amaze. We can look at the Prey Codex, also known as the Hungarian Prey manuscript, dating 1192 to 1195. We see the thumbs are invisible, just as they are on the shroud. We also see the distinct herringbone weave pattern that matches the shroud, and we see the same burn holes that we see on the shroud. The Prey Codex is clearly referring to the shroud more than 60 years prior to the 1260 to 1390 date given by the labs, which is supposedly 95% sure, so none of their numbers seem to be reliable. One last forensic objection. John chapter 20 verses 6 and 7. Then Simon Peter came along behind him and went straight into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. Is the Sudarium of Oviedo the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head? The Sudarium has blood patterns that precisely match the blood patterns on the shroud, and blood from both the shroud and the Sudarium are blood group AB, a common blood group among the first century population of Jerusalem, but roughly 5% of the current world population. The matching bloodstains give forensic evidence that the sudarium covered the head first, was removed, and then the head and body were covered with the shroud. The sudarium of Oviedo and the Shroud of Turin covered the same person. The sudarium has an undisputed history back to the year 570 AD. And this has shown that the Shroud of Turin must date back to at least 570 AD. Even Wikipedia's page on the Sudarium of Oviedo shows that the Sudarium was radiocarbon dated to 700 AD. The lab noted possible oil contamination. I know I said not to use Wikipedia for research, but it does seem that Wikipedia debunks itself here. What can be found on Wikipedia? The Shroud of Turin and Sudarium of Oviedo have 20 matching bloodstains, traces of limestone, geometries that are similar enough to conclude they were on the same person. Still not convinced? A peer-reviewed scientific journal published an article in 2022 that used wide-angle X-ray scattering to show that it is probable for the shroud to be a 20-century-old relic. My next video is going to debunk Walter Macron's conclusions regarding the shroud, especially now that we know he was wrong about another historical object. Thank you so much for taking the time to be open-minded. Please do your own research. I promise you will not be disappointed, but amazed. Will you find the truth?